Okay, so you saw in the last video that the head gasket on this vehicle is definitely gone and needs to be replaced. So obviously we need to take the head off the engine as it stands and all the ancillaries to inspect what's there, what's damaged, and whether this can be repaired or replaced. So I'm voicing this over after doing this, rather than whittering on outside for however long this took. So I'm not sure if you like these kinds of videos where you can see the whole process of the disassembly working, or whether you'd rather have something that's a bit shorter, maybe have the clips slimmed down a little bit just to show the main activities rather than each bolt. But if you have a preference, let me know down in the comments about what you'd like to see in the future. I've tried to clip this down to as short as it can be, covering all the main points in detail, because I couldn't find another guide on the internet on how to take a head off an L200 engine, so the 4056T. So if you find this useful, please let me know and we'll go through it from here. So as I've been talking, I've just taken off the top mounted intercooler for this engine. I'm removing the wiring harness here from all of the sensors on top of the engine, and just unclipping things as we go. But most of these connectors feel like they probably haven't been undone in the whole life of the vehicle, or certainly very recently. So there are some things that are very reluctant to be undone, but thankfully during this disassembly I actually only managed to snap 2 bolts, which is fairly good going for the age of the vehicle and the condition of the vehicle. So I'll take that as a win. But you will see me having a fight with some stubborn vacuum lines and piping that doesn't want to come undone. So I hope this helps anyone else facing this issue with the engine and head gasket failure. But you'll hear me probably talk through some extra bits as we go through. I've not got a workshop manual for this vehicle. I've come across a few online repair manuals and the OE repair manual, but it doesn't give any guide on engine disassembly, so I'm just going through this and picking parts off that look to be easily removable, and in the vague order that the components need to be removed in. So you will see me pick at different parts of the vehicle and different bolts. Probably there's a better way or a better order to take these parts off in, but when you're approaching something for the first time, it sometimes takes you a while to work out the best way to strip these engines down. So far I've taken the EGR valve off, you can see on the left hand side of the engine, and I've also taken the intake hose off, and we're just taking off the vacuum lines here that connect all the vacuum pipe work across the engine. So this portion is the intake side, so the intake elbow with what I assume is an intake air temperature sensor, and the part I'm holding here is the intake manifold flap, which is vacuum actuated. So there's 2 solenoids on the back of the inlet manifold, again connected to the pack of vacuum lines that I've just taken off. And as you can see, it's probably a good idea to take a picture of these vacuum lines if you need to reconnect them later, just to avoid any misconnections or mistakes when it goes back together. So here I'm just loosening the bolts for the EGR cooler. So as the exhaust gas passes through this to get back to the intake manifold, it's cooled or warmed depending on the engine state by the engine coolant which runs through it. So I've just loosened those brackets off. Here I'm doing the buzz bar that connects the glow plugs to the 12 volt power feed. So these are very small 7 or 8 millimeter nuts that hold that on, and probably best to put those back on so you don't lose them. Glow plugs can be difficult to remove. I've just given them a light seasoning of WD-40 there, but actually these ones were great, and these weren't seized in the head, which can happen, especially with old glow plugs or glow plugs that are quite long in design, so they can twist up and snap. But thankfully I was lucky getting these out and seemed to come out no problem. I'm removing the upper timing cover here, so these are all 10mm M6 bolts. Some of them go through a wiring harness connector or holder, so make sure you grab those as well. And the fan shroud that attaches to the radiator, again 10mm bolts, so while I've got the 10mm socket on I'll pick at those bits and see if I can get them off. And actually the 2 bolts I mentioned earlier that were snapped were the 2 red shroud bolts at the bottom, but like I said, only snapping 2 bolts when taking this much apart on an old car's, it's not a big deal and it's not a bad going, so. Here I'm taking off the 2 metal undertrays under the vehicle. I've probably already assumed by now that maybe 1 or 2 bolts might get dropped through here, and it's always easier if they hit the floor to pick them back up and store them correctly. You can see on top of the battery I've got a selection of Ziploc freezer bags, and I wholeheartedly recommend that if you're taking on a project like this or anything similar with a large number of unique fasteners and bits and pieces, that you have somewhere that you can store them and remember where they go. So you may see me throughout the video putting bolts into bags and labelling them up, and it's perfect for putting things back where they belong and not losing bits and pieces. Here I'm just taking off the engine cooling fan to remove the belts. So it's 4 10mm headed bolts that screw directly into the water pump pulley. It's also a good idea to cover any ports or access points to the engine or air filters that you don't want loose nuts and bolts falling into, or perhaps if you're leaving it overnight or for a little bit of time, try and keep any animals out. In the UK, not too much of a problem. I'm not expecting to get any wild animals particularly in here, but it's good to do in practice, so you might as well do it. Some of the hoses are very well attached. I suspect it's probably the first time in a long time that these radiator hoses have come off. So if you are going to do what I'm doing here with a screwdriver, which is just trying to break the seal between the hose portion and the plastic tank, that you make sure that you're carefully removing those two items without puncturing the hose with the screwdriver. So try and use a wider screwdriver rather than a smaller one to avoid puncturing it, and just go carefully, because if you don't have to replace a hose, then it's some more time and money saved. So all the auxiliary belts are now off. Here I'm taking off my homemade loom for isolating the fuel shut-off valve to check that that was working. So the red wiring on the right is just my patch loom to check that as part of my diagnosing process. Here I'm removing the EGR cooler, so just trying to again pop those coolant lines off, which haven't been undone for a very long time and just need a little bit of encouragement with a screwdriver. So you can't see, but there's a crossover pipe that I'm undoing now for the exhaust gas recirculation function, which just sits in here. Some of the bolts were a little bit tricky to get to. I was expecting a little bit more ease of use, being an old engine and more agricultural style of vehicle, but there were a few tricky ones. But in the end I managed to get them all. I think if I had the chance to do things differently again, the heat shield that I'm currently struggling with at the moment comes off with 3 bolts, so I probably should have taken that off to give myself a little bit more clearance here. Some of these nuts and bolts were particularly difficult to get to on the inlet and exhaust manifolds. So all of the fixings for the inlet manifolds are bolts, all of the fixings for the exhaust manifolds are nuts. They are all 12mm, so I'm using a deep socket, or have been using a deep socket with an extension and a wobble to get to some of them. But actually one of the inlet manifold bolts I needed to use a crow's foot to get to. It was quite an awkward fitting. There's not a lot of clearance down there, and there are a lot of things going on. So just take your time, and you can work your way through them. There are going to be a lot of jump cuts and changing times and quantities of light during this video, so I'm trying to fit this in during my lunch times and after work. So actually the time between this and the first video, which you may or may not have watched, is only about a day, so I'm just trying to fit this in around my main job. So if you're struggling to undo things as you go, maybe take a break and move on to something else. So you can see I've given up halfway through the manifold bolts and moved on to something else that I can do. If you've not taken something apart before, or you're quite new to working on vehicles, sometimes the easiest thing you can do is take off the things that you can take off and work your way through the vehicle that way. So here I'm just working on the power steering pump and getting that removed out of its bracket. So the bracket that holds that pump on also connects the head to the block, so that needs to come off for us to remove the head anyway. It's a good idea to try and hold this power steering pump up, so you can see it's got rubber hoses attached, and it's probably not a good idea to put any strain on old rubber hoses and face them splitting. So if you've got a cable tie, preferably a reusable one, which I've borrowed here from the intake to cam cover breather, it's probably best to try and suspend that somewhere. So here I'm removing the bracket that I mentioned a minute ago that connects the head to the block. Again, I think all of these bolts are 12mm. In terms of bolts and fixings, so far on this engine it's been incredibly easy to work on in terms of quantity of fasteners. So being old and Japanese, theoretically if you've got a 19, a 17, a 14, a 12, a 10 and an 8 and a screwdriver, you can pretty much take anything that you need to do apart. So here I'm trying to undo a bolt from an exhaust manifold heat shield, which again, surprise surprise, it's 12mm, but actually it's the clearance is such that you can't get a socket in there. So what you've seen me do is link two spanners together to effectively give you a larger lever. So if you're ever struggling for undoing a fastener and you can't get an impact gun or a socket on, try getting two spanners and combining them to give you a bit of extra help. This part I'm just removing now is the oil feed to the turbo. So I think on top it's a 17mm socket for the banjo side, and it's a 12mm fitting for a spanner on the other side, where it takes the oil feed from the head. Probably a good idea to be careful with this one, because you don't really want to twist or snap that line if it's old. Here I'm removing the injector lines. So these are all 17mm spanner fitment. So you need to disconnect the 4 feeds from the fuel pump, which I'm doing here, and then the 4 lines for each, or 1 line for each injector. So these are all captive nuts on the flared lines, so you don't need to worry about losing those, but I would say cover the ports on the back of the fuel pump to ensure that there's no dirt and grass while you're working on the rest of the engine, or which could potentially cause further issues. So make sure you cover those with a cloth or something similar. There's a coolant line here which runs along the side of the head and feeds into other coolant lines at the back of the block, but this portion needs to be removed to take the head off the vehicle. So again, as per most of the fasteners on this vehicle, it's a 12mm socket, so just make sure you undo that line and don't get it caught as you're taking the head off. Here I'm breaking off the bottom pulley bolt. So if it's a manual vehicle, you can put the vehicle in gear, get somebody to help you, and stand on the brakes as you break this nut off. The factory value for torquing this up is about 180 Newton meters, so if you're still unable to get it off, you can, against your own judgment, place the breaker bar on the floor and flick the engine over in the correct direction with the ignition, and it should crack off. But like I said, it's not a recommendation for you to do that. I'm certainly not recommending that you do that, but if you so wished, you could do that. It may be helpful if you have an automatic as well, because applying the brakes and putting it in gear won't help you. Here I'm removing the nuts for the tensioner for the timing belt. Again, as per most other things on this engine, it's a 12mm bolt. So you may have seen earlier in this video that I placed the engine at top dead center position. So it's a good idea that you do that when you're taking engines apart or removing significant pieces from the engine, such as any timing related components, because when you need to time things back up, everything should be in the correct position. It doesn't matter so much for a head removal, but certainly if you're just replacing the timing belt, you should position the engine at top dead center with all the timing marks aligned before you remove and replace the belt. To take the timing belt off the bottom pulley, you need to remove the crank angle sensor, which is two 10mm bolts. Once that's removed, you can then take away the timing ring and then remove the belt. So I'm now removing the water pump. So this portion attaches to the block. You could, I suppose, if you so wished, leave the water pump, but seeing as they're quite inexpensive, and particularly in this instance, as the head gasket had gone in this vehicle, you never know the conditions that these parts have been subjected to. So when you have a head gasket failure, it's probably a good idea to replace the water pump and thermostat and any parts of the cooling system. As a general rule, you could consider a radiator replacement as part of the replacement process after a head gasket failure, but you need to assess the condition of that yourself. In my instance, the cooling ability, the cooling fins of the radiator were compromised and flaking away, and for the cost of the replacement part, I just decided to replace the radiator as a just-in-case measure. The coolant feed for the top of the radiator attaches into the head and links back into the line that goes to the back of the block to connect to some other coolant hoses. So you will either need to remove this part from the head to remove the head, or you need to remove the hose from this port. But seeing as the hose was seized basically into the fitting, I chose to remove this portion instead. Again, 12mm headed bolts. Removing more coolant lines with screwdrivers. As I said before, just be careful that you're not piercing the hose with a screwdriver, and it's a good idea to use as big and blunt a screwdriver as you can to avoid punching it through the side of that hose, especially if it's old and brittle. Bolts for the cam cover, again, two 12mm headed bolts. So here I'm undoing the rocker arm shaft. It's a good idea with anything here that's under tension from various cam lobes. It's a good idea to undo it in sections. So I would recommend that you start at the outside and move towards the inside or towards the center of the cam, and I would undo it in different sections, or take your time undoing it, because if you undo one side and then the other, there's going to be a lot of bending. There's going to be a bending force on that armature, and you're going to risk snapping it. So just take your time, undo the bolts gradually, and work your way from the outside in. I'll discuss this later in the video, but some of the rocker arms had some damage to the caps which contact the top of the valves, but we'll go through that in detail in a bit more time in the video. So here I'm undoing the head bolts. So these are a 10mm hex. So some of these bolts are outside the cam area of the head, so they are prone to rusting. So you can see on some of these here I'm having to hammer in the Allen head socket to avoid slipping out and stripping those bolts. So take your time with these again, and check the factory engine manual and make sure that these bolts are undone in the correct order, because if you are keeping the head and reusing the head, it's a good idea to remove them in the correct order so that you don't cause any warping or any damage to the head. So again, like the bolts we did a minute ago, take your time with these and undo them in stages. So here I'm just chipping off the washers for the head bolts, because we need to reuse these when we replace the bolts. So you can potentially reuse these bolts that we're taking out here, but you need to check that they are the correct length as per the factory manual. So these bolts can be stretched and can be stretched outside of their factory specification, and when reusing these bolts they can give you an incorrect torque value when torquing the head back down, and can cause head gasket issues and failures. So for the price of the bolts, it's worth replacing them with new bolts, in my opinion, just to ensure that you are having the correct clamping load from the head to the gasket. So you could remove the turbo and the exhaust manifold to make removal of the head easier, but for the sake of time and looking at the state of the nuts joining the exhaust manifold to the turbo, I've elected to try and leave it in place while I remove the head. So I'm just trying to pry it away here, and please be careful if you are doing this to not mar the surfaces of the exhaust manifold or head, because you need that to create a good sealing surface again, so please be careful when you're doing this. So here we can see where the head gasket failed. So you can see on cylinder number 2 there's been a failure between one of the water passages or water jackets. So it's the lighter spot. As before, make sure to block or to cover any open ports, because we don't want anything falling in there or causing issues later down the line. So here I'm checking that the engine turns over smoothly, so you can see on cylinder number 2 the piston colour is quite clearly different. Here I'm checking the piston to deck clearance. So what I wanted to make sure here is that we didn't suffer any bending of our rods. So I checked the value of each piston crown to deck clearance on each cylinder to make sure they were all within a reasonable range. So on cylinder number 2 we are 0.65 millimeters above the height of the deck, and going through and checking all of the other pistons, they were all within 0.1 millimeters of each other. We did have some marking in the bore of cylinder number 2, but it was above the height of the piston rings, and the engine turned over smoothly. So I gave it a quick hone, or a very light honing, and actually, although appearing or having some marks to the fingernail and to the finger, actually there was you couldn't feel anything there. So based on the position of that and how it felt, I'm happy to run with this this block. So I've removed the head gasket material with a Stanley blade. That's my preference. You're welcome to follow yours and what works for you. But what works for me is using a Stanley blade to remove the old material. So I'm quite happy with how that works. Okay, here we are. Here is the offending article. So first thing I noticed when pulling these arms off, you may have seen that on a few of the lifters they should have these little caps, but on these ones here, they are here, they are around, but they were not attached as well as the others. It's just a small metal cap in a plastic retainer, but a few of these retainers are, can you see, either bent or snapped, so no longer functioning as a retainer. So we lost 3 of those, but we have them here. Here's one that's out of its retainer. It's a little cup, just sits on the ball on the end of the rocker arm, and this is what contacts the top of the valves. Now, I have actually already inspected this, so I'm a little bit ahead of you, and it's a little bit cheating, but the damage is a lot worse on the other side, unfortunately. Actually, it's now damaged to such an extent that this head is destined to be recycled because it's of no use. Take a trip with me to cylinder number 2. Yes, that's not good. So you can see there's a lot of damage here to this part of the head. Obviously should be looking somewhat like that, or like that, or like that. But unfortunately, this head's done. It's junk. So we need to order a whole new head assembly. But we'll get started stripping this one down, and we'll take a few things out. We'll pull the injectors, pull a few things off. We can save the cam as a spare. Tops of the injector. And to brace them, we can use a 24. Carefully try and remove the fuel rail return without snapping anything, which I think we have done. Yeah, I think we're okay. Lovely smell of old diesel. Now to try for the injectors, which are not a 17, not a 19, try 21. .22. As much as we probably shouldn't use an impact on a non-impact socket, we're going to use an impact. 1. So this is cylinder 2. Not looking particularly great, but we'll check the others. certainly looking very different to number 1. Number 3, number 4. Bit of brake cleaner, see what we're looking at. Number 1 again. So I did see you can strip these injectors down a bit further because they are mechanical. So I think probably in another video we'll strip this down, potentially replace the second injector, and see what we end up with at the end. So thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next part where we try and put this back together. Obviously, as I said, we're going to need a new head. This one's not salvageable, but thankfully the assemblies for these engines are quite cheap. Well, certainly here in the UK anyway. So stay tuned and hopefully we'll get this sorted.